So this week's discussion asked us to consider this week's lectures and readings. They were focused on public leadership and leadership in a crisis. Please discuss ways that you believe organizations can prepare leaders at all levels to respond in a crisis. Consider in this discussion the communication issues faced by BP in the spill and failures of crisis communication. So, for me, after reading the text, I think that the most important thing when it comes to having all levels of the organization ready and to take on a crisis is just preparation through all levels. So, just making sure like the leaders that are chosen have, that vigilant decision making skills that the book was talking about to be able to respond in a crisis well. Um, Having like a really strong crisis management plan and a crisis management team. So it goes back to picking the leaders. And I think one of the other things is as like a continuous improvement process is for organizations to remain humble and when they're responding to crises be able to take ownership so that way they can establish that credibility later on when they're trying to improve and also be humble in the sense that they shouldn't ignore like signs and things that are coming up and know that there's always room for improvement. Because I think that's one of the major things that happened with the BP is because they were just ignoring all of the things coming from like the lower down people in the organization saying like, oh, we need to improve this, we need to fix this. And then it ended up leading to, a huge disaster.
Yeah, I think one of the main things when I was reading was that when it says that you're in a like the pre-crisis stage is that like you said like so many people they just kind of like relax and like don't think about like crisis because like nothing is happening right now, and I think that is one of the main things. I think it's to always kind of like look what can go wrong and how can we prepare for it. And one thing I just kept thinking about was when I was like in elementary school or even like in high school, and we used to have like fire drills, and like we have to like there would be such a specific like way, and like all the teachers would know like how to like set us up and how to like and like how to leave the building like to the closest exit. And I kept thinking about that when like they're talking about like prepare for crisis and have like training things where you like know what to do in a crisis. But yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think the thing that I was thinking about was the thought popped into my head a lot. Like if I were like a CEO or something, or like running a company or something, I would probably consider like in my mind it would be tempting to consider all these like fail-safe measures or the pre-crisis leadership, all that kind of stuff. It would be easy for me to think of that as like a waste of time, because you've got like these goals and these things that you want to do. And so I think like reading about like the internal and the external scans and like constantly monitoring your own operations. Like I think that's what like BP kind of failed to do, is that they were so busy trying to grow their business and doing all this different stuff, like purchasing other companies and stuff and growing, that they didn't do an internal scan to like see where they're actually very vulnerable. And so I think being humble and careful enough to be able to look and see, I think that makes a big difference. And also external scans, because like I think it's easy for an organization to be kind of complacent a little bit and like inflexible and thinking that they've just got to stick to what they're doing and do it well, um, in order to succeed. But being flexible takes of it takes a little bit of like it's a lot more energy for sure. And it's sometimes, I know, like even working at Starbucks, like if I try to tell people to do something a different way or like to be a little more flexible based off of what's happening, a lot of people take it very like, no, I just want to do it the same old way. And so I can imagine that the same thing happens on an organizational level.
Well, it's kind of interesting. So I was just thinking about an example too. So I took my first cruise this past summer, and I've never been on a cruise ship. And I don't know if you guys have or not, but when you get on, part of the procedure is the evacuation process if something were to go wrong. And it was an amazing process because it was Norwegian Cruise Lines, and it was a huge cruise ship. And the way that all of their, like, I guess you could say their management staff, they all had like specific instructions, and they had to get us all like lined up, and it was a whole procedure. And I thought, because I was worried, to me, I think of the Titanic, and I was like, what happens if we go down, right? And after that whole procedure, I felt like very at ease because you could see that they had a plan, and it was manageable. And basically women and children are going out first, which I'm like, okay, cool. Me and my daughter are going to be off. But anyway, reading the text, the things that like really kind of stuck out to me, it says, there's nothing quite like a crisis to test your leadership. It will make or break you. And I truly believe that true leaders are going to either shift gears and go into like problem solve, mode, or they're going to become complacent. So a lot of it was talking about, as a leader, you need to find a tendency, fight the tendency to become complacent. And I think about managers I've worked for that do become complacent. So they also talk about, in addition to battling that, leaders also have to overcome human bias, errors in their own decision-making and judgment, institutional failures, so organizational breakdowns in the process, and then special interest groups or resistance from groups that look out for the interest of their own members. So, it's one of those, I think, things that hold you up as a leader. Like, you get in a bad situation, and even in life, you get in a bad situation, and do you just like drop your hands and quit, or do you figure it out? So to me, I think that's a true leader. And it's kind of interesting because this chapter's towards the end of the book.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. One thing you noticed with the BP thing too was like when it was talking about the CEO or whatever, and how he said like that he wishes his life would just return to normal.
Oh gosh,
like,
yeah.
And then how he took like a yacht like trip or something. Like that made me mad because I remember when the spill was happening and just seeing like oh my God, like all the animals like would be just covered in oil. Like, oh, that was just so sad. And just knowing kind of that there was kind of stuff that they could have done, but just like their leadership was bad, and just throughout the whole organization, like they weren't prepared for this crisis at all. And then kept trying to downplay it too.
They like didn't even care. Even like the people whose like family was affected, like people died. Like there's this one lady talking on the video, and she said like they had sent a letter and a check for her dad, but she also lost her mom.
Yeah.
And they didn't send anything about her mom. So I mean, they just like didn't really even care about anything that it was really affecting. They were just being selfish about it. And I mean, that was from start to finish. They're just trying to cover up their mistakes and move on.
Yeah. I thought it was crazy how they, like at one point it said that they thought that, or they felt like that BP cared more about carving out these settlement checks to people rather than actually solving the problems. Like everything is about trying to cover up their own tracks rather than lead in a way that cares about their employees and cares about their feedback, because they ignored like tons of safety measures that they definitely knew about that they just chose not to deal with. And so it felt like the whole leadership was backwards, like trying to, the whole thing about not caring about the people, their employees, really struck me as well. It made me kind of mad about the way that they handled it too.
Yeah, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Like you want to look up, okay, BP, like who and where does that money go? And I want nothing to do with it, honestly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
But yeah, I think one of the things that I've seen in, like good organizations is just creating that culture of like, okay, it's okay to, blow the whistle if you see something that's happening that isn't, ethical. I think having like maybe something in place for that for BP could have helped prevent those kinds of things, like maybe bring in some kind of government regulation. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Well, yeah, it talks about looking for trouble. Like I'm totally with you. Like if you are a responsible organization or company, you want to know what your faults are, your weaknesses, and address them before it turns into a crisis.
Yeah, there was this, I can't remember. I read it in the book, but I remember my dad telling me about it too. I think it was Ford or some other car, but like they knew that, yeah, like they knew that that was like, could have been a risk, but then they weighed out like, okay, if like, how much will it cost like to figure out lawsuits versus to like fix all these cars? And they figured that the lawsuits, so they risked people's lives. And I think people did die just so they could save.
So I can give you a personal experience. I grew up in Northern California, and there was a 2-lane highway that I would have to take home, and there was no like signal light. So it was just like if you were coming on the northbound side, you would make like a left turn into the neighborhood, and if you were going the opposite way, you'd make the right. But there was no like protection. So I was 19 years old, and I remember seeing accident after accident in this little like turnout spot on the highway. And so if you can imagine being on a highway and having to come to a complete stop to turn in, and I was driving, and there was it was kind of interesting. So the oncoming car towards me was coming, and I saw a police officer, like a sheriff, behind him. And so I'm coming down the hill, and he's coming towards me to turn into the neighborhood, and he had his blinker on, and I'm about to pass, and he turned right into the front of my car, and I'm going 65 miles an hour in a small little Honda. And so it was a head-on collision. And I just remember my car like spinning, and like literally there's like a cliff, and I almost like went over the cliff. But back then they wouldn't put a signal light in until there was a certain percentage of accidents. And I think it was actually that percentage.
Oh, wow.
They installed a signal light.
Right.
So
Take one for the team.
Yeah.
Yeah, every time I see that signal light, I'm like, I think I'm the cause of that.
That's
funny.
insane.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. Oh my gosh.
But
Well, at least
that's
now they have
how they rectified whether or not to put a signal light in.
Yeah, how many accidents.
But that's how it goes. Business, signals, government. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's not how to deal with a crisis. That is bad leadership.
Right? Luckily I lived.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, is there anything else you guys would like to add?
What's that?
Any final thoughts?
I'm good. Just gave you guys my personal story.
I'm glad you're alive.
I think we're good.
Okay.